Welcome to the UnionDues podcast. The UK's only all things union show, produced for your downloadable digital delight and appreciation. In this special episode, after a Labour landslide in the general election, Melissa Ansell-Bridges from the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions on her hopes for the future. Hello and welcome to the UnionDues podcast, the UK's only all things union show. I'm Simon Sapper, and in this special episode, we're going to be, well, let's put it like this. What if you woke up on a Monday morning and found out that over the weekend, a minority Labour government had been re-elected, but this time with a huge majority? They could govern alone. All those things that you'd thought about, hoped, discussed, consulted on, suddenly could be delivered. A gilt-edged opportunity. That's exactly the position our colleagues in New Zealand found themselves in last month. And our guest on today's show is Melissa Ansell-Bridges, who is the General Secretary of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. It's quite a challenge, as you can imagine. Now, that's not the only reason for focusing on New Zealand in this special episode. I'm pleased to say that UnionDues has a goodly number of listeners in that part of the world. So, to you, let me say kia ora, and thank you for your support for the show. But before turning to Melissa, it's probably helpful to have a quick overview of what the New Zealand economy and labour movement looks like at the moment. And apologies if I'm telling you stuff that you know already, but the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions has about 350,000 members, 27 affiliates. It's the largest democratic organisation in New Zealand. Now, the New Zealand labour market and employee relations was deregulated big time in the early to mid 1990s, and union membership took a real pounding, but there's been gradual and consistent build back, and density now stands at just under 21.5%, so a little less than it is here in the UK. Now, even though New Zealand has generally been reckoned to manage the COVID crisis really well, unemployment is still up in the country. It's now at 5.3%, and that shows a 1.3 percentage point increase over the stats for the preceding quarter. Median weekly earnings are just over 1,000 New Zealand dollars per week, and the exchange rate is £1 UK to $1.92. There is a national minimum wage, which has just gone up to $18.90, and there was an election pledge by the Labour Party to hit the $20 mark in 2021. There is an informal national living wage of $22.10. The electoral system is a mixed member proportional system, which is part list and part constituency based, designed to make it very, very difficult for one party to achieve a majority. So I'm really grateful to Melissa for spending some of her very valuable and very sparse time with us to talk about the prospects for the New Zealand labour movement in the coming period. And without any further ado, here she is. Melissa Ansell-Bridges, General Secretary of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, very much welcome to the UnionDues podcast. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to having a chat.
And a very exciting time, of course, in New Zealand with a majority Labour government for the first time in yonks, and a government that's clearly so confident it's said to the Greens, come and join us in government, even though they don't actually need to form a coalition. Yeah,
so it's a little more complex than that. We have quite a funny electoral system in New Zealand with MMP. So that's why we haven't had a majority any government for decades. They have two ministerial positions, but they're sort of outside the cabinet. So I'm not sure about the language that they're using, but I suspect that they will be referring to it as a Labour government as opposed to a Labour-led government. I personally would have absolutely put my money on Labour needing the Greens to govern, and was quite surprised that they did just that well on election night. But it's cool. I mean, in terms of what we're looking at wanting to achieve in the next couple of years, Labour's got some really great policy. The Greens, We did a little election scorecard for all the parties. The Greens got an A+ from us. Labour got an A. There were just a few areas where the Greens sort of went further on some important issues for us. In a way, actually, things might have been a bit easier for us, or we might have been able to take some issues a bit further had the Greens had a bit more leverage in those coalition agreements. But yeah, I mean, as it is, we've got a great new workplace relations minister, and they've got some great policies.
Organiser for the finance union, I believe.
That's right, yeah. So Michael Wood had previously been working at FinSec, which no longer exists, is now various amalgamations, part of First Union in New Zealand. He was an organiser a while ago, recently has worked in local body politics, and has been an MP for a while, but this is his first ministerial position. And so he is Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, and also he's got transport as well. So he's going to be quite busy.
He's going to be a busy lad, isn't he? Yeah. So the agenda, as you say, is quite crowded. And I understand that there's some low-lying fruit in the sense that things like fair pay agreements, a lot of consultation and work has been done already. That's almost good to go. Is that correct? And what, in a nutshell, what is a fair pay agreement?
Yeah, cool. So fair pay agreements basically is an industry bargaining framework. So New Zealand doesn't and hasn't for a couple of decades had any structure for industry-wide bargaining. So everything is on an enterprise by enterprise basis, and that's really hard.
That's right. The structure of New Zealand trade unions is not dissimilar to that in the UK, in the sense that there are areas of strength, but overall density is taking a real pounding. I think New Zealand trade union density is around 21% at the moment. So there are lots of areas where it's been really hard, in fact, almost impossible to get through the door to organise. Yeah,
that's exactly it. So you tend to have, higher density in those areas of the public sector where, I mean, essentially you are negotiating with either one or a handful of large employers. And then there's other areas in the private sector where it's just impossible nearly to organise, where you've got lots of employers who, and it's very easy to set up a small business in New Zealand as well, which is great, but it means that, you have whole industries which are dominated by relatively small businesses who might just have a couple of employees each. It's really hard to organise in those industries. So fair pay agreements would be negotiated between unions and employer groups, but they would then be, the terms and conditions in them would be compulsory across the whole industry. So they're really about preventing a sort of race to the bottom, or preventing businesses from competing on wages. Compete on whatever else you want, but don't compete on terms and conditions, so it's about putting a floor in place, but also having that kind of arrangement between unions and between employer organizations as well. You can take a more, I suppose, targeted approach to things like health and safety in specific industries where you've got, specific things you need to be thinking about, or, industry-wide training programs that benefit the industry as a whole. There's sort of an opportunity there for coordination of the industry as well, to make the industry as a whole stronger, with the union and employers associations sort of having that framework already for those sorts of conversations. But I mean, that's a massive piece of work. It was an election, policy at the last election, so 2017, and there was extensive consultation done on it. So there was a working group established, working group report, and then there was a further consultation which the government undertook. And I think ultimately towards the end of the last term, it was stymied by New Zealand First, who was one of the other parties in government, and, just sort of didn't get across the line. Also then, COVID, there were other priorities as well,
But no one can say that this is a surprise. Given that level of consultation, it's something that's been really fully thought through, and it raises kind of three questions for me, Melissa. The first is who negotiates this sector by sector if actually there are sectors where, for whatever reason, there's no union input. The second is will it cover contractors? Because one of the biggest risks to terms and conditions is when things are contracted out. So therefore, is there an obligation all the way down the labour supply chain, as it were? And then the third thing, I realize I'm throwing these things.
This is good.
but the third thing is if you get a fair work agreement, what's the relationship between that and the New Zealand national minimum wage?
Okay, these are all great questions.
Does it overtake the minimum wage and make it kind of obsolete, as it were? So, sorry, take your pick.
Okay. So a fair pay agreement. So it's not a given that every industry is going to have one because they have to be initiated. And so there are still some details of the policy which we're not entirely sure where the government's going to land on things because there was a little bit of vagueness and, well, not vagueness, but like unanswered questions from the working group report, right? So some of these things are unknown, but our preference for obvious reasons is that fair pay agreements are union initiated. So if there isn't a union in an industry, it's unlikely that a fair pay agreement would then be initiated and exist in that industry. So I suppose what it does then do though is it creates an incentive for unions to go into industries which otherwise it's just too hard to organise in, right? So that's the first thing. In terms of contractors, our expectation, our hope would be that it would cover contractors, it would cover independent contractors. Obviously, there are some complications where you have terms and conditions which sort of relate to employees, which don't make a lot of sense when you try and apply them to independent contractors. But I think it's really important that, as you say, that floor, that we find a way of sort of translating those terms and conditions across the industry, because otherwise you're just incentivizing companies to contract out, which, entirely undoes the whole reason for having
totally
fair pay agreements.
It, doesn't it? If you're an independent kind of contractor, as it were, and you are allowed to sell your labour at a rate that is below that set by the fair pay agreement or the national minimum wage, kind of what's the point? It busts the whole idea, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there's another piece of work which we can talk about in a bit around contractors in New Zealand, and basically how there are huge pockets of people who are currently working as contractors or engaged as contractors and really shouldn't be. But it's such a arduous process to challenge your employment status that most people don't, because there's actually no point in it, or it would cost so much money, or it would take so long. So there is that issue, and I think that needs to be addressed through other means as well. But certainly you don't want to be doing anything which incentivizes that at all. Yeah. Your last question about minimum wage, I think the expectation is, we've got a relatively high, well, it probably sounds high, but our minimum wage is $18.90. It's lower than the living wage. We would, I think, expect that fair pay agreements, you'd probably expect that the pay rates would be above the minimum wage. And again, the minimum wage and other minimum sort of entitlements, terms and conditions in our industrial law in New Zealand would still apply to these groups, but the purpose of the fair pay agreements would be to sort of try and lift that floor above those.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comparison with here in the UK, because for this to be moving forward, indeed for such a strong vote for parties of the centre and the left suggests a consensus in New Zealand society that just doesn't exist here. A consensus that there are two problems. I think the first is that even if unions organise in new sectors, employers' organisations are not always still robust or in evidence. So if you like, the unions have no one to negotiate against, which is a problem for thinking about sector level bargaining in the UK. And the second is employers would be extremely concerned, really resistant, I think, most of them, to the idea of a high floor in terms of pay.
Trust me,
too fragile.
Yeah. No, and they are here too as well. Some employers are in favour of fair pay agreements, especially the ones who are sort of trying to do the right thing, or are wanting to pay decent wages and are having those efforts undermined by other companies in their industries. So there certainly is support from those companies who see that, actually we don't gain anything as an economy by, the sort of race to the bottom. But there are definitely employers who are scaremongering about fair pay agreements, especially sort of in the context of COVID and COVID recovery. But, we don't think that austerity is the solution to economic recovery either. And, New Zealand's had challenges with productivity for a really long time. We've got a relatively low wage economy and, huge inequality as well, and a lot of poverty from people who are in full-time employment. It's really hard for a lot of people, and we've got to change how we're doing things. So I think, fair pay agreements will make a massive difference for a lot of working people. Yeah, we've just got to get them across the line. So hoping that it doesn't take too long.
So I understand absolutely, and I think it's a vital thing, isn't it? The unions need an incentive to organise outside their core areas, and if the incentive is once you get into a new industrial sector, if you're effective, then a fair pay agreement the process for the fair pay agreement kicks in. But if we roll it forward a little bit, what happens if the two sides can't agree? What's the kind of arbitration mechanism? Is there an arbitration mechanism?
Yes. So one of the potentially more controversial parts of the design of the fair pay agreements is that industrial action wouldn't be allowed during negotiation of the fair pay agreement. So it would be allowed for disputes, obviously, in the industry outside of that, but during negotiation for the fair pay agreement, it wouldn't be. And disputes in that space would be dealt with via compulsory arbitration.
Right.
Yeah, because you've got to have a tie break. If you're not having,
you've got to have you have.
Yeah.
Who does the arbitrating?
I don't know if that was landed on, but I mean we've got a mediation system through our Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So it may be them, or it could be one of those things which is agreed by parties at the start of the process, who you'd go through, or what organisation you'd use if you need to go through arbitration. But it would be, ultimately it would be arbitration rather than just mediation.
Right.
You'd go through the steps of you'd go through the steps of mediation, but then ultimately, if you really have to, then you'd get to arbitration.
It sounds like this has been designed out of the system, but is there a risk that New Zealand might end up in a position not dissimilar to, say, the Australians, with the Australians Fair Work Commission, where you have lots and lots of sector-level rulings, but actually not a great deal of enforcement?
Interesting. I mean, I suppose it's possible. I think that initially there will probably be some form of sequencing for the industries in terms of how many, and what we still don't know as well, it still hasn't been decided on. There's quite a bit actually, is around the initiation process for starting that. So it is possible as well that the negotiation of them is sequenced, so that I suppose as we're starting the process of having this new framework in place, that we can be ironing out those issues as well. Because obviously, having a system which then isn't enforced doesn't make any sense. But, the terms and conditions in the fair pay agreement would form a part of the employment agreement.
And also the rights are enforceable by the individuals, aren't they? I mean, if there is a sector level agreement and a small business in a remote part of the country is not playing by it, then the employers, the workers themselves, have the right to self-start enforcement action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's another way as well in which working people will have or could have potentially greater contact with a union, which they might not otherwise have if they do need help with that enforcement. I
mean, I imagine your affiliates must be really optimistic about this. It's a huge organising fillip, isn't it?
Yeah. absolutely.
So, do you see signs that they are kind of reconfiguring somewhat to meet this organising opportunity?
Yeah, I suppose. And actually, this is quite good timing because we've got a union leaders forum this week, so it's a big sort of strategy planning day, thinking about the next 3 years. But one of the things that we'll be discussing there is really around how we maximise the growth opportunity that comes from some of the legislative, developments that we're expecting in the next couple of years. Fair pay agreements is a really big one. We have had some experience, or some of our affiliates have had some experience in a similar way with pay equity claims as well, which have happened across a whole industry. So that was, in situations where unions have taken on a bargaining role for a group of working people, not all of whom are necessarily members, I suppose is the similarity. And it doesn't happen automatically. You've still got to do a lot of organising, but there is growth that can come out of those opportunities as well, when people start having contact with the union. And obviously, you need to be put in touch with people to be able to bargain on behalf of them. So there's sort of that point of contact, that conversation that can happen with people who might not have had contact with the union previously.
It really is something of a golden opportunity.
And you can, there's that sort of opportunity as well for people who have perhaps never been a part of it, like a collective process, who then are sort of bought into that and can see how awesome that is as well. So it's sort of a nice introduction.
Do you find that there's this kind of intersectionality that people who the people who are hardest to reach in terms of organising, the people who have least contact with unions, also tend to be younger, perhaps more women, perhaps from minority groups, and therefore, when you deal with one of these aspects, you start to deal with the others as well, and you have a cumulative effect that's very good in terms of equality and diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And the age one's really interesting. I'm 32, so a lot of my generation, my friends, they now all know what unions are, but there's I absolutely can see that there are, there's sort of this generational thing. There are people my age now who grew up after, the reforms which happened in the 90s, which just destroyed the union movement in New Zealand, who really have never heard of a union, don't know what unions do, or think they're just a thing that like teachers do because they sometimes see those, protests or whatever on the news, but really have not had any contact at all. And then at the same time have, like, as a group of people, this horrible precarious work environments with, really casualized contract. So there's absolutely an intersection there with the kinds of work that people who are already sort of disadvantaged or in more sort of economically precarious situations end up in. And then, that sort of lack of contact with unions as well. It's really challenging.
In that context, then, what we touched on earlier in our conversation about contractors, about extending this employment rights platform or floor to contractors is particularly important, intervening to stop this kind of vicious cycle. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is an issue that I'm really, really passionate about. So before starting at the CTU, I worked for 3.5 years at Equity New Zealand, which is the actors union. And actors in New Zealand are basically all engaged as contractors. Right. So it was a union of contractors, which was quite unusual. And it was something that I occasionally there were sort of conversations, but I felt like it was part of it was the sort of acknowledgement that contractors existed and were working people too, and really needed better support and protection. Felt like it was missing often from conversations in union environments as well. And the government in their election policy, they discussed the desire to do some work addressing the rights of contractors and looking at collective bargaining and so on, which is really great. There was a consultation which we partook in about a year ago as well about what needed to be done to protect contractors better, basically. And I think that some of the challenges when you're talking about the kinds of policy improvements that are needed to protect contractors better is that there's such a range of what it is to be a contractor. You know, you have people who are very well paid and very, you know, strong negotiating positions, doing, you know, really specialized work potentially, who really don't, you know, they're doing absolutely fine. And then you've got a lot of people who are actually really, really struggling and absolutely being taken advantage of as contractors as well. And sort of everything in between. And I think the big challenge in New Zealand, and I'm sure it exists elsewhere as well, is that the law and the way that the law is implemented around employment status is really complex. So we've got a number of different tests which all need to be sort of taken into account in assessing an individual's situation. They're all common law. They're not in legislation. So actually understanding, you know, if you were someone who thought that you were potentially incorrectly engaged, trying to understand what the hell the law is to see, you know, whether or not you should be an employee, it's really inaccessible. And then to actually challenge it, you've got to go through the courts, which is a slow process. It's an expensive process. And then the decision only applies to you specifically. So, you know, people don't end up challenging employment status unless you've got like a really strong personal grievance case, you know, because otherwise it's just not worth the time and the money.
Gosh, I mean, that's kind of where I'd start. Yeah. I think, you know, if I really wanted to fix this inequity, this unbalanced playing field, it's the employment status piece.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's an access to justice issue as well. Like, we have to start by enforcing the law as it exists, because that currently doesn't happen because it's just too hard. So actually, if you incorporated the tests into legislation, you made it more straightforward and you made it more of an administrative process potentially as opposed to a judicial process, you made that free of charge to, you know, get that kind of an assessment. And then you did things like extending those kinds of decisions to other people on similar contracts in the same workplace, or potentially even the same industry as well. Or, you know, if you had authorities providing guidance about, you know, if people are on these kinds of contracts in this industry, then you should really, you know, be looking at engaging them as employees and providing that kind of advice. I think you'd go, you know, quite far in terms of addressing those kinds of, I mean, it is a breach of the law. It's just one which we sort of don't seem to be actively doing anything about, and it's just kind of accepted that this is a bad thing which happens, but we'll just leave it be because we don't really have the structures in place to do anything about it. It just seems like madness to me, you know, like, do all you want to, you know, and as unions, it doesn't make any sense strategically to me either to be ignoring contractors. You know. No,
absolutely not. I mean, I think you've kind of answered the next question I was going to ask you, which is, if we were to roll forward to the end of this parliamentary term, 2023, and New Zealand Labour and the Greens were to come to NZCCU and say, election time again, can we count on your support? You know, what would you have hoped they'd have achieved in those 3 years? But clearly, I imagine resolving employment status or taking steps to resolve that is on the list.
Oh, it's definitely on the list. I mean, I would be saying fair pay agreements have got to be in law, and we've got to have some of them negotiated. You know, we need to make real progress on that. And then contractors is a must. We ended up with a bit of a laundry list going into the election of the things that we wanted parties to be doing, but the other things that are on there are a review of our Health and Safety Act, and there's some specific asks in around health and safety as well. So it's things like, you know, greater acknowledgement of psychosocial harm in the Act and better workplace representation, because it's not mandatory to have workplace reps in small businesses.
Oh, okay.
So any business under 20, you know, and as I said before, we've got a lot of small businesses in New Zealand. There's a lot of places without reps. That's really important. And then, you know, we're also really keen to see greater support for displaced workers in New Zealand as well, and that feels very topical currently. So we have no minimum statutory redundancy in New Zealand.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
So that's really challenging. Also, supporting welfare reform as well, because our benefit system is really punitive and also basically impossible to survive on. But we have also been advocating through the Future of Work Forum, which has been set up by this government to sort of talk about, future of work issues, for a social insurance model as well. So like a sort of state-run, employment insurance, basically. And so, we want those kinds of supports in place, which, have future of work, outcomes as well.
Yeah.
But, feels very relevant in the current, climate, which is so uncertain. And then the other thing, which we're hoping will happen very fast, is that we've been asking for sick leave to be doubled, because currently it's 5 days and it's not enough in a pandemic.
Or even without a pandemic. I mean,
or without any flu season. Take any flu season, or and if you have kids or you work in a service industry, and 5 days goes very fast.
That's for sure. Melissa, wow. I mean, this is going to be a huge challenge for yourself and your affiliates. I mean, but in the best of ways, really, isn't it? Because it's all positive stuff. This is, you've not got not just one glass that's half full, you've got a whole shelf of them. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it does really feel like, we've got 3 years in which there's a degree of certainty about the environment that we're operating in, and there are commitments around certain pieces of policy that we've wanted for a long time. And so, there's definitely more that we're keen to see as well. We're always pushing to go further and faster, but we're really excited about the work that we're expecting to be able to get done in the next 3 years.
Brilliant. Well, the very best of luck, and I shall be watching with keen interest.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can update in 3 years' time.
I would love to.
And see where we got to.
Let's do that. Melissa, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Cheers. Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, listeners. It really is a fascinating view on an environment where things are quite different to what we have to put up with in the UK at the moment. The idea of fair pay agreements, sector level bargaining on that grand scale, that's really intriguing. That's kind of mouth-watering in a way, isn't it? A very attractive prospect. But of course, as you heard from my discussion with Melissa, there are lots of details that have to be worked out in terms of how that's going to work. And also, there's this kind of real thing about contractors, isn't it? If you can treat subcontractors differently to those who are primary workers, if you like, in the sector that's governed by a fair pay agreement, you've got a huge hole in that kind of safety net. Really interesting stuff. We'll have to see how it develops. And there are all sorts of other things that really, as I closed the interview, I thought I kind of should have spoken about this maybe. The fact that it's not all sweetness and light in New Zealand, although there's a lot of optimism, a lot of good about the government and about the culture there, of course. I mean, poverty disproportionately affects Maori and Pacifica peoples in New Zealand. You heard Melissa talk about the deficiencies in health and safety regulation, the fact there's no redundancy cover or compensation. And then again, her own story, how you move from being a union activist to being an official in a CTU affiliate to being the general secretary of the CTU, all by the age of 32. It's a good story in itself. Maybe we'll have to go back and cover that ground. But of course, the primary purpose of the podcast was to look at how a national trade union centre can interact with an incoming Labour government. I hope we've achieved that. If you want to find out more about what Melissa and her colleagues at the CTU are doing, the CTU's website is union.org.nz. If you'd like to hear more from general secretaries, other union officials, union activists across the world, if you like this format of the Union Dues podcast, please join the discussion. Let me know. You can email the show at uniondues@makesyouthink.com. You can tweet us at DuesUnion. If you've got any comment about the ideas that we were discussing, again, please join the conversation. UnionDues@makesyouthink.com is the email address you need. And if you head over to the makesyouthink.com website, you'll find the companion blog to this podcast full of background information, signposting, and more links than a golf course. Well, that's just about it for this special episode of the Union Dues podcast. Thank you very much for your company. Thanks to Melissa for giving up her time to join us. Do keep your eyes peeled on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and so on, for details of our next special episode and also of the new Union Dues series, which will launch in January 2021. It just leaves me to say, whatever you're doing, wherever you're doing it, I hope you and yours are all safe and well, and all being well, I'll see you around sometime soon. The UnionDues podcast is presented by me, Simon Sapper. It is a Makes You Think production.